Hey guys, Dr. Brandon Crawford here. I'm the founder of the Austin Center for Developing Minds. We are located just north of Austin, Texas in Cedar Park. And what we do is we focus on developmental functional neurology. Hopefully you'll have a chance to catch my lecture because I'm going to be taking you through what that process looks like and why it's so important to focus on rehabbing the brain in the right way, at the right time, with the right frequency and oscillations and all this kind of stuff, right? So I'm very honored to be a part of this conference. This conference is very meaningful. I love all the people involved, and obviously the cause is fantastic. So thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Due to advances in technology and bioscience, the most efficient ways emerging to treat pain and injury revolve around the nervous system. Using the human body's amazing ability called neuroplasticity, it is now possible to activate increased strength, pain-free movement, and faster healing. This is the Newbie device, a patented electrical stimulation device used for neuromuscular re-education. While conventional treatments for pain and injury only manage symptoms, the Newbie device allows you to work at the source of the problem. Using this approach, 90% of individuals notice meaningful progress in the very first session, and evidence is showing those early results also lead to faster overall recovery from most injuries and surgeries. There's finally help for people having difficulty recovering from injury, living with chronic pain, or experiencing challenging neurological conditions. Ask your doctor or therapist about the Newbie from NewFit, accessing the power of the nervous system to improve outcomes.
Hello, my name is Dr. Richard Temple, and on behalf of Team Luke, Hope for Minds, thank you very much for attending this presentation. By way of brief introduction, I am a clinical neuropsychologist who has been practicing in the field of brain injury for close to 20 years. I am currently in full-time private practice in Austin, Texas, where I work with individuals with a variety of disabilities. I also consult at 2 facilities, post-acute brain injury rehabilitation facilities. Prior to full-time private practice, prior to 2012, I worked for 2 different post-acute brain injury rehabilitation facilities in Dripping Springs, and before that in Galveston, Texas. The title of my talk today is Managing Challenging Behaviors in Crisis and Calm. So here we are in 2020, which arguably for most of us has been a lot more crisis than it has been calm. And even for those of us who've had relatively little crisis aside from what COVID-19 and other challenges of 2020 have brought us, managing those stressors on top of existing crises, like having a loved one, a child with a brain injury, I can't even imagine what kind of stress that must produce. So to that end, I wanted to give this presentation and make this contribution to Team Luke Hope for Minds. What this talk today is going to be is presenting hopefully an easy to understand, easy to remember heuristic for managing challenging behaviors. Now, as I went through my training as a psychologist, one thing that struck me is almost from day one, I was learning about managing behaviors. Back in Psychology 101, way back at the beginning of my college career, understanding positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement and punishment. And frankly, learning those definitions was not that difficult. I needed to know them for the test, and it really wasn't too difficult to remember them. Little tricks in understanding the difference between negative reinforcement and punishment and things like that. But once you had those down, you think understanding behavior would be fairly easy. And understanding it at an academic level certainly wasn't that difficult. But then as theory moved into practice and I was charged with having to work with individuals and managing behaviors and actually doing the behavior modification, I quickly learned that what was easy in principle was often not that easy or even very difficult in practice. It's easy in the calm of your dorm room to remember the definition of positive reinforcement, but implementing it in a behaviorally charged situation in the context and in the face of a challenging behavior is not so easy. So I hope this gives you some information, a little bit of information to be able to handle those things and remember some of the definitions, not when things are calm only, but in those crises. So brain injury, we're going to go through this very briefly because you all are probably all too familiar with it. But as we've probably found out, for those of us who've had to deal with loved ones with brain injuries, there's a host of complications and problems and challenges to manage. And among those, behavioral problems are often some of the most disruptive. And what we're talking about with those kinds of behavioral problems are things like verbal and physical aggression, non-compliance with expectations, your loved one not doing their chores, not going to therapy. It could be almost anything, family duties, and poor initiation, just not wanting to do much of anything. So what about this thing we call behavior? Well, we could break it down. It's not this simple, but we can break it down into two broad categories. One scenario is that a desirable behavior is lacking and needs to be increased. Something like not doing your exercises, not going to therapy, not doing your homework, not doing your chores. So there's something lacking that you want to happen that's not happening at the moment. The flip side of that, the other scenario, is that there's some undesirable behavior that's present that needs to be decreased or eliminated, whether it's yelling or screaming or cursing or physical aggression, verbal aggression. Something's there that you don't want there anymore. This sounds like two completely diametrically opposite types of scenarios, doesn't it? And in a sense, it is. So it would be logical to think that if they were two very different scenarios, they would have two very different responses or antidotes to them, if you will. That's actually not the case. Although they seem like opposite problems, the solutions to both is the same solution, and that's to increase the frequency of some behavior. So some parents might be able to relate to this, some who were born in the 1970s or in the 1980s. I grew up in Chicago back in the 1970s and 1980s. And the response to drugs for children was an initiative that was called DARE, Just Say No to Drugs. So that was there were commercials, there were vans, there were police initiatives, and the slogan was just say no to drugs. It seems simple enough, but when you think about it, in a sense, it was a little bit ridiculous. To sort of make this a little bit humorous, I always imagined a group of teenagers who are at about that age where they might decide to start experimenting, standing on a street corner saying, wow, well, the police officers and the teachers and our parents are saying, just say no. So what do you say we just say no? And the other kids will say, yeah, let's just say no. And then they stand there for a minute and they say, well, if we just say no, what do we do? And as you can imagine, it won't be long before you transition from just saying no to going back and doing the negative thing that you were planning on doing anyway. So what it doesn't provide us is a positive alternative. So what we're going to talk about in this talk is positive behavioral change. So the kind of the clinical geeky way of saying is the world abhors a vacuum. If you remove something, if you take something away, that leaves a hole or a vacuum. And the universe and our brains and everything else does not like a vacuum. So we seek very quickly to fill that vacuum. So the answer to this is you stop a negative behavior by replacing it, by filling that hole with a different behavior. And there's a couple ways of doing, there's multiple ways of doing this, but several of them are, one of them, against the psychological term, is the differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors. And in plain words, what that means is if you reinforce something besides the unwanted behavior, you may increase the frequency of that other behavior. So if you don't want your child using drugs, you may reinforce them going to the library or doing their homework or helping their grandparents with a chore. And you reinforce that, and they will be doing that instead of the behavior that they don't want them to do. A related term is the differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors. So again, going back to some of those examples that I just gave, if a child is at their grandparents' house helping with chores, they cannot physically simultaneously be at their grandfather's house helping with chores and on the street corner susceptible to using drugs. So it's an incompatible behavior. One cannot exist without the other. So that's sort of what we're going to be talking about today. So as I've said before, in theory, behavioral change seems fairly simple. There's a few definitions that you have to know, and then you're set to go. I thought about this, and not being from Texas, moving to Texas and falling in love with it pretty quickly, I thought about what it must be like to write a book about bull riding. Now, as you can see from this picture, it's a pretty scary endeavor, but you would think that the booklet, the instruction manual to bull riding would be fairly simple. It might be something like step 1, get on the bull. Step 2, open the gate. And step 3, don't fall off the bull. Simple, right? In principle, it couldn't be any more simple. But as we can see from this picture, and if you've ever watched bull riding, it's anything but easy. It might be simple in concept, but very difficult in practice. And we're talking about the same sort of thing in behavioral change. So I'm going to present, with no further ado, a model of behavioral change. And this is not only a model, it's like a model, it's something, somebody, something to emulate in terms of how he, she, it manages behaviors. And you're probably wondering at the edge of your seat saying, who is or what is this model that I need to emulate in terms of understanding and being able to modify behavior in a positive way? So here we are, the ideal model of behavioral change. That's right, a Coke machine. And by way of full disclosure, I'm not being endorsed by Coke to do this presentation. This could just as easily be a Pepsi machine or any other kind of vending machine that dispenses drinks or candy bars or anything else. But for the model of simplicity and ubiquitousness, when we think about sodas, we think about Cokes. We're going to talk about a Coke machine. So why is a Coke machine an ideal model of behavioral change? Well, let's look at what it does and, as importantly, what it doesn't do in understanding why it's an ideal model of behavioral change. So first of all, a Coke machine makes its expectations very, very, very clear. When you look at a Coke machine, you don't have to have much familiarity to understand how the thing works and how you get what you want. First of all, there's a price posted somewhere on the machine. It tells you what the cost is for one Coke. And so it's easy to see what behavior it's expecting of you if you want what it has to offer. Second of all, it has reward choices. It'll show you, here's what you stand to get as a reward. You can have a Coke, you can have a Sprite, you can have a Diet Coke, you can have a Dr. Pepper. There's many different kinds of options usually in a Coke, and it kind of tells you what's available. Next, it shows you how to execute the behavior, specifically what behavior you want. There's a coin slot. There might be a bill slot. The way things are nowadays, there's probably even a credit card slot. But it shows you what your options are and eliciting the behavior to get the reward you want. So everything is very clear in terms of its expectations. Next, in terms of why a Coke machine is an ideal behavior modifier, is barring some kind of malfunction, when you perform the correct behavior, it rewards you every single time. So say a Coke is $1. You put in $1, you get a Coke. You put in another dollar, press the button, do what it says, you get another Coke. It's very consistent in how it rewards you. Next, and as important, if not even more important, when you do not perform the correct behavior, it never rewards you. If you put in no money, it won't give you a Coke. If you put in 75 cents, it will not give you a Coke. If you put in 99 cents, guess what? It will not give you a Coke. It's very consistent in its doling out of rewards. Why is this important? Number one, again, clear expectations. The Coke machine has told you by virtue of its signage, here's what I expect, here's what I want, $1. If you don't give it that dollar, you don't get rewarded. Another important reason is the concept of extinction. No, not extinction in terms of the dinosaurs, the poor souls that have been gone for a very long time, but behavioral extinction in a psychological sense. If you elicit a behavior and you don't get a reward, eventually, if that keeps happening, you will stop eliciting that behavior. Human beings and even animals, other animals, dogs and cats and things like that, we do not, and they do not just elicit behaviors for the heck of it. If they elicit a behavior and nothing happens, if something bad happens or nothing happens, it won't be long before that behavior stops being seen and it becomes extinct because it's not benefiting the organism in any way. The quicker this can happen in terms of extinguishing these bad behaviors, these negative or undesirable behaviors, the better off we all will be. So another reason, and this might start to hit pretty close to home, either in our own behaviors, and again, I'm a clinical psychologist, but I would be fooling you and flat out lying to you if I didn't tell you that I have made some of these mistakes myself, and sometimes I make them often and frequently. So just because I have an advanced degree in psychology doesn't mean I'm prone to the same kinds of mistakes. However, another reason why a Coke machine is an excellent behavioral modifier is it doesn't attempt to justify its actions. I would imagine you've never gone up to a Coke machine and put in 99 cents or 75 cents when it asked for $1 and got nothing, and then started to talk to the Coke machine and say, come on, Coke machine, I know that you don't pay $1 for a Coke. I know you only have to pay 35 or 40 cents. So come on, let's cut a deal here. How about 75 cents for a Coke? That's more than adequate, isn't it? You don't do it. And why don't you do it? Because you know that it doesn't do any good to argue with that Coke machine. You can yell and yell and yell and scream and talk and even rap at one, and it just doesn't do any good. So by virtue of that, we don't do that because the Coke machine has done an excellent job of shaping and forming our behavior so that we know that it's not worthwhile, not useful. So what does a Coke machine do? Well, when you fail to elicit the correct behavior, a Coke machine does one of two things. One of the things isn't really a thing at all. Nothing. It just ignores you. It doesn't talk to you. It doesn't yell at you. It doesn't chastise you. The light doesn't even blink. It just sits there as stoic as it can be. I bet you didn't know a Coke machine was that smart, did you? So that's one thing that it could do. Again, now we're in the digital age where things are a whole lot more advanced. Another thing that it might do is deliver a very brief message unemotionally and over and over and over in the same time, again and again. Insert coin, insert coin, insert coin, or insufficient money, insufficient money, insufficient money, over and over and over again. It does so unemotionally. It's not, doesn't, you can't tell that the machine is angry or agitated or irritated. It does the same thing over and over again. And also you'll notice it doesn't change the message. And if you think about that in contrast to when we're dealing with somebody who's not emitting a behavior that we want or is emitting a behavior that we don't want, you notice how sometimes your message tends to change, right? It's like, why? Because I said so. Well, here's the reason. And you go on and try and justify it and you try and explain it in different ways. Why is that a bad thing? Well, one of the reasons that it might not be ideal is for the simple fact that if you're changing your message, number one, the more that you're doing it, you're probably showing that you're getting agitated. And number two, it signals to the person whose behavior you're trying to modify that, so to speak, the game is still on, that your decision is still prone to argument and changing. But if you say the same thing over and over and over again, you're very clearly indicating that this is not negotiable in any way, shape, or form. So moving on, why else is a Coke machine an ideal behavior modifier? If you notice, it never delivers a punishment. It may fail to reward you because you didn't perform the correct behavior. Occasionally there's a malfunction, but it never delivers a punishment. I would hope you could all agree that you've never received an electrical shock, or the Coke machine has never fallen on you or otherwise harmed you or hurt you. It just doesn't deliver the reinforcement. So we'll see in a second why that's important. So you can think about when you're in those periods of stress and storm and crisis, and you're trying to work with somebody and trying to modify a behavior. Hopefully this will give you a little bit of an easy way to think about how a Coke machine functions and how you can do similar things to achieve behavioral change. So let's talk about a couple of other behavioral modifying machines that may also be near and dear to your heart and close to home, and why they're less than ideal, why they're inferior to our venerated Coke machine. So there's two others that we're going to talk about. Here's the second one. Also plugs in, also lights up, the slot machine, also delivers reinforcement. So how is a slot machine different than a Coke machine? Well, let's look at it. Number one, there's a different reinforcement schedule. We already talked about with a Coke machine, when you put in the dollar or whatever it's asking for, you get a reward every single time. If I was able to see a show of hands and I asked how many of you ever put a dollar in a Coke machine or whatever amount it asked for and didn't get a Coke, some of you might raise your hand. Now, if I asked you how many of you, after that happened, put in another dollar, I bet a whole lot of hands would go down. Some of you might raise your hand and say, yeah, I tried it a second time. Now, if I asked you how many of you did it a third time and a fourth time and a fifth time, I bet next to nobody would raise their hand. That's just futile and asking for trouble, right? Because you know the schedule of reinforcement, and obviously something is amok with our Coke machine. Now, for those of you who may have been to a casino or have otherwise patronized a slot machine, I'll ask you again, how many of you put a quarter in a slot machine and didn't get a reward? Most people would raise their hand. Everybody would raise their hand. And then if I were to ask you, well, how many of you put in a second quarter, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a 10th, a 20th, a 50th, a 100th quarter, a lot of you would raise your hand. Why is that? The reason is because of the expectation of the reinforcement schedule. A slot machine is on a constant reinforcement schedule. I'm sorry, a Coke machine is on a constant reinforcement schedule. $1 for one Coke. A slot machine, on the other hand, is on a variable reinforcement schedule. You may get rewarded right away. It may take a while. And also, as we know, it's not just getting back the quarter that you put in or getting back an equivalent amount. You may get back one quarter, you may get back two quarters, you may get back 20, 50, 100. You may hit the jackpot and get 1,000 quarters. So it's a much different reinforcement schedule than the Coke. We've also probably never put a dollar in a Coke machine and got 25 Cokes out. It just doesn't work that way. So it's a different reinforcement schedule. and it's what's called an intermittent reinforcement schedule. Now, Gamblers Anonymous has told you, I'm sure if anything, or if you've tried to kick the habit or spend less time in a casino, an intermittent reinforcement schedule is a very addictive schedule. That's why people get addicted to gambling much more than they get addicted to Coke machines, because we're looking for that payoff. And we know if we just keep going and going and going, hopefully we'll get that payoff. There's a lesson in that for us as far as modifying behavior, and it's a little bit counterintuitive. But if you're working with a child and the child's emitting a behavior that you don't want or not emitting a behavior that you don't want, and let's use a scenario. Let's say that we're at the great grocery store with your child, and he or she is throwing a tantrum because they want a candy bar. You're saying, no, we've already discussed this. You're not getting a candy bar. And boy, do they throw a fit. They are screaming and stomping, and in 2020, maybe taking their mask off and causing a big scene, embarrassing you, might be knocking stuff off the shelves. And you're trying so hard to stay strong because you don't want to give in and you don't want to reinforce that behavior. Admirable as it may be, but things are getting worse and worse, and more destruction is taking place. And you soon come to realize that you're not going to win this battle. To the extent that you can do this, if you're going to give in and you know you're going to give in, I would say give in sooner rather than later. There'll be time to fight this battle another day, but the longer you hold out, the longer it's going to take in the future to extinguish that behavior. And you can think about that with the slot machines. Boy, oh boy, I got 40 quarters. If I got a $10 bill and got 40 quarters, and I got really nothing the first 30 quarters, but the 38th quarter, my gosh, look what happened. I won $50. So then that you remember, like, oh, okay, it might take 38, 39, 40 quarters to get some kind of reward. But that's also telling your child it might take 38, 39, 40 minutes of tantrums, or however you might measure it, to get what I want. It's going to take a lot longer to extinguish that behavior than it would the $1 or $2 that you put in that you don't get anything from a Coke machine. So there's one other behavior machine that we're going to talk about that's also not an ideal behavioral machine by any stretch of the imagination, and that is the bear trap. So what is a bear trap as a behavioral modifier, and why is it not good? Well, look at this thing. What is a bear trap? A bear trap is something that is really going to do nothing but inflict pain. If you look at this, do you see any reason to approach this at all? Do you see any positive that would come about messing with this thing? No, absolutely not. And even if there's a little piece of candy or something in the middle of that tongue thing in the middle, taken as a whole, it's really just not worth approaching. So what is the human equivalent of this? The human equivalent of this is somebody who doesn't reinforce somebody. They're just there to punish. And so we do our very best just to stay away from these kinds of people. A bear trap is going to be an ineffective behavioral modifier. Why? Because somebody isn't going to go anywhere near it, because there's no reason, there's no benefit of doing so. And again, 2020 has been a challenging year for a lot of things. And without any political statement of which side you're on or anything, it's also been a difficult year for our law enforcement. And I created this talk long before 2020 and long before these things came up. But you think about our own dealings and interactions with the men and women who serve us as police officers. So do we ever seek out police looking for positive reinforcement? Usually not. Usually we call the police when something's wrong, and when we see the police, we assume something's wrong. I think about your own dealings with driving a car. You're never really happy to see a police officer when you're driving your car. And another reason why, so to a large extent, police officers primarily dole out punishment. If you break the law, you get pulled over, you get a speeding ticket, something like that. If you fail to use your signals or you go through a red light, they pull you over and dole out some kind of punishment in the way of a fine. So why is this not entirely effective? Because again, when I give this talk live, I'll ask everybody, so how many of you who have driver's license have sped? Everybody raises their hands. How many of you who've sped have at some point received a ticket? Almost everybody would raise their hand. Then I'll ask, how many of you continue to speed? There's usually some giggles and a lot of hands will go up. See, but you were punished, you were fined. Why would you continue doing that? And if you think about it, well, the answer was, well, I still do it, but I do it a little bit differently. I try to do it where I don't think there are police officers, and I try to be smart about how I do it. But you know what? At the end of the day, for one reason or another, speeding is reinforcing. It gets you to where you're going quicker. For some of us who are thrill seekers, it might be kind of fun. So there's reinforcing qualities to it. We just try to do it in a way where we avoid the source of punishment. So we may have a radar detector. We may only do it in open spaces where we can't see police cars. And we know that look in our, that feeling in our stomach when we see a police car, our first move is to step on the brake. So we just try to avoid the source of punishment. So that makes sources of behavioral modification that don't dole out reinforcement, but only dole out punishment, a less than ideal source of behavioral modification. So a behavior trap, just to kind of summarize, it lies in wait to deliver punishment. It has little or no history of delivering rewards or positive reinforcement. And it's really no reason to approach the bear trap. It's just a force to be avoided. So what is punishment? I mean, intuitively, we all kind of know what it is, but let's look at it in terms of sort of scientific definitions. The definition of punishment is it's in the introduction of some stimulus following a behavior that decreases the probability of that behavior. Now, again, I bet a lot of you who have sped and have gotten a speeding ticket, it's probably decreased your behavior at least for a little while, right? So that's the definition of punishment. It decreases behavior. There's positive punishment and there's negative punishment. This is just really for academic purpose. Well, positive punishment is introducing some kind of a stimulus. And the police example is admittedly kind of ambiguous. So, you touch the stove, you get burnt. That's the introduction of a positive punishment. The pain is the positive punishment. And negative punishment is the removal of something that you had in response that decreases the probability of behavior. So if you didn't have a very generous police officer when you got pulled over, you probably experienced negative punishment, and that your bank account was a few $100s lighter than it was before that encounter because the court or the jurisdiction took money away. That's negative punishment. So we talked about this already. There's two possible responses to punishment. You could either decrease or eliminate the behavior, or you could find somewhere away from the bear trap to perform the behavior. So punishment isn't without its benefits. There's a reason why we use it in our society, and it does have some value. But there's two rules that have to be followed. Number one is it has to immediately follow the inappropriate behavior. You can't punish somebody 3 hours, 5 hours, 10 days after they elicited the behavior. They just won't associate the two and it won't be effective. And also it must never be used in isolation. Punishment must be used selectively, and the large majority of what you must do must be positive reinforcement, reward kinds of things, not negative reinforcement, or not punishment. So let's talk about designing an effective behavioral plan. And again, this is not as easy as it sounds like in theory. Again, I worked for over 8 years, and I continue to work with post-acute brain injury facilities. And one of the tasks that I'm often charged with is designing an effective behavioral plan. Now, it's difficult under the best of circumstances. In that kind of setting, it's particularly difficult because you're dealing with lots of different staff members, therapists, direct care staff, 3 or more separate shifts. So it has to be a plan that's very simple, very understandable, that could be executed very consistently. So that's one of the main ingredients, is that you have to plan ahead. You cannot design a behavioral plan on the fly and expect for it to work out. Believe it or not, a poor plan or a poorly executed plan is worse than no plan at all. In my workings in those post-acute facilities, it wouldn't be uncommon that I would be approached by direct care staff or therapists as like, it's Friday afternoon and I'm getting ready as we all are to enjoy a nice, relaxing weekend. It's like, well, the therapists are going home, the weekend staff is going to be on, and we've got to design a behavioral plan to stop this, whatever behavior it is. And you sit down, it's 3:00 on Friday. The weekday staff is going off, the weekend staff is coming on. We've had no time to really plan this. And really, anything that we do is not going to be effective. It's just not going to carry over. So it's almost better to not put a plan in place at all than put a plan in place that's going to fail. Because it leads to intermittent reinforcement. So you're going to have a bunch of slot machines out there rather than a bunch of Coke machines. What are the steps in a successful behavioral plan? Number one, you have to define the behavior in concrete, observable, measurable terms. Not, I want my child to be nicer, more compliant, more polite. Those are great goals, but in terms of creating a behavioral plan, you've got to do much better than that. It has to be something that's countable, quantifiable, and that everyone would agree whether or not the behavior occurred or didn't occur. It's very unambiguous. Number two, you have to identify the reinforcers. Now, again, by way of a little bit of academic information, a reinforcer is very similar to a reward, but it is different. So a reinforcer is any stimulus that delivered following the behavior increases the probability of that behavior. So $10, is that a reward? Well, most people would argue that it is. Is $10 reinforcing? It depends. It depends on whether or not it increased the behavior. So oftentimes, this is a trial and error process to try and determine what's reinforcing to the individual, what they're willing to work for to increase some behavior. And then you have to develop a schedule of reinforcement between the behavior and the reinforcer. Are you going to deliver that reinforcer every time they emit the behavior, every other time, every 5th time, every 10th time? And there's a whole science to this that's a little bit beyond the scope of this talk, but you have to kind of establish all of these things in advance. So other things to consider, we are all under the influence of multiple schedules of reinforcement, some of which we're aware of, some of which we're not aware of. Both are likely very effective. You don't have to be aware that a plan is in place in order for it to be effective. So to tell a little story that I heard one time, I'm not sure if it's true or not, but it illustrates the point very, very nicely, is that there was a college professor in a Psychology 101 class giving a talk in a large lecture hall. And the lecture hall must have had 300 students in it. And there was basically a right side of the lecture hall and a left side of the lecture hall, and it was separated by an aisle. And the professor had just given a talk the lecture before on positive reinforcement and all of these things that we just talked about. And so the students got together and decided that they were going to try an experiment. And what they decided to do is everybody on the right side of the lecture hall was going to make eye contact with the professor and just look absolutely enthralled and interested and nod and smile and just socially give all kinds of cues that they were just enthralled in getting what he was saying, or she. And everybody on the other side of the lecture hall, the left side, was just going to not make eye contact, look as bored as they possibly could, yawn, roll their eyes, do all these things. And then somebody was going to measure which way the professor looked more. And of course, before they did this, being good scientists they were, they measured how much he looked to one side versus the other beforehand, and for the sake of argument, determined that it was pretty much equal. And so then they did this experiment and noted that predictably the professor looked to the side where everyone looked enthralled and interested 90% of the time, far more than to the other side. So after this was all over, they asked the professor if he had any idea what they were doing, and he didn't, but it still nonetheless had this effect. So we are under schedules of reinforcement that we're not aware of at all. Um, Other things to consider: reinforcers do not have to be material or monetary to be effective. And there's a good reason why they shouldn't be. Do you have to give your child a nickel or a quarter or a dollar every time they do a chore in order for your behavioral plan to be effective? Or do you have to give them a piece of candy or some piece of food? And the answer to that is no. And thankfully, for several reasons. Number one, it could get really expensive, right? You could run out of quarters or nickels or dollars if they elicit the behavior. And number two, in the case of something like food as a reinforcer, what happens? Eventually you get full and you don't want any more candy, and then you're sort of out of luck in terms of being able to deliver that reinforcement. It's also an argument for intermittent reinforcement schedules where you may reinforce only every second or third or fifth or 10th instance of that behavior rather than every one, to get more of that intermittent reinforcement schedule for the behaviors that you want. But things like positive attention, a smile, a pat on the back, things like that, praise, are extremely valuable reinforcers. And you know what? They're free and they're easy to deliver, and people love them. So they're good in so many ways as far as being an effective behavior modifier. So don't underestimate these uses, these reinforcers, as being very valuable and very powerful. As parents or anybody dealing with children, one thing that we hear all the time when we implement a program like this or try to do positive parenting or disciplining and things like that is hearing, "That's not fair. Why did you do that to me? That's not fair." Well, two potential responses that I could think of to this. One is the one that my father often said to me, and he said, "Boy, whoever told you life was fair did you a complete disservice. Now get over there and do what I told you or else." So that's one possible answer, and sometimes that's appropriate. But another one may kind of be to kind of think about this in a different way is, are you being fair? So it brings up this concept of natural consequences, and I'll illustrate this with a story. During back in my time of working in post-acute brain injury rehabilitation as the director of neuropsychology, I was sitting down for a meeting, and all the therapy disciplines were there. And there was this one particular therapist who was not a psychological therapist or a behavioral therapist of any kind. He was a physical therapist. And he sat down in the meeting and it was just all exasperated, but at the same time proud of himself. He's like, John, who had a pretty substantial brain injury, refuses physical therapy. He's always refusing physical therapy. So you know what I did? He really loves his hat. So I took his hat away. And I told him that he could have his hat back when he participates in physical therapy. And I proceeded to almost fall off my chair for several reasons. Number one, kind of cruel. Number two, it's not a natural consequence. And you don't have to be all that sophisticated to understand that. There's no logical connection between not doing your exercises and your hat disappearing. Again, you're speeding down the road. Would it be expected that you might see some flashing lights behind you and get a little bit of a lecture and a fine? Absolutely, that's a natural consequence. Would you expect to experience sharp pain down your back or an electric shock or something like that in response to speeding? No, of course not. So you would be very unlikely to associate a sharp pain down your spine or an electric shock with that behavior of speeding and thus change the behavior. So it's not effective. So the more natural a consequence is, the more likely that consequence is to be effective. So that brings me to the end of to this lecture, to this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. Again, with this format, I can't answer questions right now, but I think the way this works is that you're allowed to submit questions, and I'd be happy to answer those. So please submit away, and I'd be happy to do those. So it was a pleasure. Thank you very much, and good luck with all that you do.